which leads us to today's speaker, who I don't think needs any introduction. Very familiar face around the History Center by now, but of course, our very own Siobhan Heraty, our Curator of Collections. She comes to us with a Master's in Public History from Loyola, and she has been at a couple different area museums, West Chicago City Museum, the Colonel McCormick House at Cantini Park, and of course has come to us, been with us since August 2018, and she's already been an essential part of the museum. So we are happy to have her, and this is just a really wonderful look at a topic that's very close to Des Plaines history and something that I think a lot of people in the area can relate to. So without further ado, Siobhan, if you want to go ahead with Des Plaines Takes Flight.
All right. Well, thank you, Emma, and good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us tonight. And so like Emma said, I'm Siobhan Heraty. I'm Curator of Collections at the Des Plaines History Center, and I will be speaking with you guys tonight about the history of aviation in the Des Plaines area. And our current exhibit at the History Center, Des Plaines Takes Flight, covers the history of aviation, aviators, and airports in the Des Plaines area in far more detail than I will be able to get into during this talk tonight. So when we are back open to the public, please stop by and take a look around the exhibit if you're interested in learning more. And like Emma said, the exhibit will be up through the end of 2021, so still plenty of time to see it. And if you have any questions about anything I talk about today, I will be happy to answer those as best I can at the end. So today, in 2021, we know that aviation is an important part of the Des Plaines area thanks to nearby OHara Airport, our neighbor just to the south. But decades before OHara opened in 1955, aviation already had a strong presence in the Des Plaines area. And since the early days of flights, over a century ago, there have been airports, aviators, and even airplane manufacturers located in the Des Plaines area. And over the years, aviation has played a pretty important part in the growth of Des Plaines, from a small town surrounded by farmland to the modern suburb that we know today. And so humanity's fascination with flight, it dates all the way back to ancient times. There's the story of Icarus in ancient Greece, the man who tried to fly with wings made of feathers and wax that melted in the sun. And then a bit later on, there was, during the Renaissance, Da Vinci, who sketched hundreds of designs for human flying machines. So humans have been dreaming of flying through the air for thousands of years, really. And we finally achieved flights on December 17th, 1903, when the Wright brothers succeeded in the first powered flights. And their flight only lasted 20 seconds, but those 20 seconds really did change the world. Now, over the decade after the Wright brothers, aviation advanced to the point that during World War I, both sides of the conflict, the Allies and the Central Powers, trained pilots for military service in reconnaissance flights and aerial combats. And many viewed fighter pilots, these new aerial soldiers in the war, as knights of the sky. And some of the best fighter pilots from World War I became household names. Like here in the US, the most famous pilot from World War I was Army Air Service pilot Eddie Rickenbacker, who in that photo on the right-hand side of your screen, he's the guy standing at the far left, leaning against the front of the plane. That's Eddie Rickenbacker, a World War I ace pilot. And when World War I ended in 1918, many military pilots returned home to the United States and hoped to continue flying as civilians. And they took advantage of the cheap surplus planes that the military was selling in the years after World War I. And they tried to make a living as pilots. But that was not a really easy thing to do at the time. In the 1920s and 30s, flight was still very new, and there really weren't a lot of full-time jobs for pilots yet. The first commercial airlines were forming in the mid-1920s, but very few people traveled by air until after World War II. So there really wasn't much of a demand for commercial airline pilots at the time. So flying airmail routes for the post office did offer one avenue for an aviation career, as the post office continually expanded their routes throughout the 1920s and 30s. And some well-known pilots, like Charles Lindbergh, for example, flew airmail routes for the post office to make ends meet and to get paid to do what they loved, which was flying. Now, some pilots decided to go a different route to make ends meet, and they chose to capitalize on the public fascination with flight. And so these pilots traveled the country as performers in air shows. They performed stunts like wing walking and parachute jumping, and they took the public on short airplane rides for a fee. And they often set up their acts in farm fields, which provided the open space needed for an airfield, and also gave these performers their name, Barnstormers. And there's two photographs on the screen of a barnstormer from the 1920s performing two different stunts while his plane is very high up in the air, wing walking on the top of that biplane at left, and then hanging from the bottom wing of a biplane on the right-hand side without wearing a harness, it looks like. So he's just hanging there by the strength of his arm, which seems a little terrifying to me. And here in Des Plaines, we had two residents who did perform as barnstormers in an act together. Ed Geeson, who's on the left in his Des Plaines Fire Department uniform, and Charles Chick Wheeler, who's the man standing in the center of the right-hand photograph in the flight suit, the light-colored flight suit in the center of that photo. And Ed Geeson, he operated the Geeson Ice Company and the Des Plaines Cab Company with his brothers. He was also in the Des Plaines Volunteer Fire Department. But his local claim to fame was really as an aviator and a parachute jumper. And Ed Geeson was actually the very first person in Des Plaines to own their own airplane, so he had that distinction as well. And his partner in the Barnstorming Act, Chick Wheeler, he served with the Army Air Service during World War I, and over the course of his life, he spent 30 years on active duty with the Army Air Force, and then later on with the US Air Force when it split into its own branch of service. And Wheeler retired as lieutenant colonel from the Air Force in 1957. But in his younger days, in the 1920s, Chick Wheeler was known throughout the Chicago area by the nickname the Daredevil of Des Plaines for the parachute jumps and aerial stunts that he performed in barnstorming shows. And the very first parachute jump that Chick Wheeler ever made was here in Des Plaines on the 4th of July, 1919 or 1920. We're not sure which year for sure. But Wheeler jumped from Ed Geeson's plane into the city's 4th of July festivities in the park below. Now, some pilots did not become barnstormers and chose a less adventurous, less dangerous way to make a living. And many decided to open small airfields, and many of them operated flight schools at these airfields as well. And these small airfields, they were a place where those fascinated with aviation could pursue a dream, their dreams of taking flights either as a career or just as a hobby, or people who were just interested in aviation but weren't interested in learning to fly, they could just watch the action from the safety of the ground. And throughout the 20s and 30s, a number of small airports opened throughout the northwest suburbs, more than I'll be able to mention by name today. And you can see the locations of many of them on the map that I have here on the screen. And it's apparent from the map that many of these airports stood near the Des Plaines River and ran parallel to the river, really. And that was on purpose, those locations, because these were the days before GPS navigation and radio communication as well. So pilots had to rely on their own eyes and just regular old road maps for navigation. And so they often followed the path of highways, railroad tracks, rivers like the Des Plaines River, because these were things that could easily be seen from the air, and pilots could use them as navigational aids they could follow to their intended destination. So a lot of airfields were located right on each side of the river, running parallel to the river, so that they could be found easily by pilots who were flying along the river there for navigational purposes. And so there were several airports, small airports that stood within and just beyond Des Plaines, and among them were Ravenswood Airport, which was at Touhy Avenue and Mont Prospect Road, just north of where OHara is located today. Art Wetter, who is the man in the right-hand photograph, he took flying lessons at Ravenswood Airport in 1936, and is photographed here in his leather flight jackets, and in front of that plane he was learning to fly in. And there's another airport that was also very close to Des Plaines, Heath Experimental Airfield, which stood across the streets on Potter and Dempster from Maine East High School. And Heath Experimental Airfield is where airplane manufacturer Ed Heath tested his company's small airplanes. And he wound up also providing a lot of distraction to the high school students across the streets who could see the airfield from their classroom windows and spent more time paying attention to what was happening at the airfield than what was actually happening in their classroom. But the Heath Airplane Company, their most successful model was a plane called the Parasol. The company sold these either as factory-built planes, or they also sold just the $5 blueprints to the plane so that people could build their own airplane themselves at home for a lesser cost. But planes like the Parasol, they were test flown at Heath Experimental Airfield across from Maine East there. And now River Road airports stood at River Road and Touhy Avenue, and sometimes I always saw it referred to as Park Ridge Airport as well, so it had a second name, River Road or Park Ridge Airport. And in the 1920s, Ed Heath, so the same guy from Heath Experimental Airfields, he was also connected with River Road Airport, and he operated a flight school out of River Road Airport in the 1920s. But the small grass airstrip called Orchard Airfield that stood near Manheim and Higgins Road in the unincorporated farming community of Orchard Place. Orchard Airfield would wind up becoming the most consequential of all of these small airports of the 1920s and 1930s, because Orchard Airfield's location near Manheim and Higgins would ultimately become home to one of the busiest airports in the world, OHara. And on the right-hand side of the screen here, we have a pencil drawing of Orchard Airfield as it appeared in the 1930s. And this was drawn from memory by Tom Baranski, a Des Plaines native who remembered visiting the airfield as a child in the 30s. And so it shows this drawing shows the really humble beginnings of this site. It's just a single grass airstrip with a small shed that was about the size of a two-car garage for a hangar for the planes, and a single gas pump there to fuel the planes. So a very, very small site in the 20s and 30s was the little airstrip at Manheim and Higgins. So there were also two larger small airports, smaller, medium-sized probably airports that opened near Des Plaines during these early years of aviation. Naval Air Station Glennview, which was at Lake Avenue and Shermer Road in Glennview, and that first opened as Curtis Reynolds Airport in 1929. And a few years later, the Navy purchased the airfield. Today's Chicago Executive Airport is also nearby, but it was known for decades as Palwaukee Airport. And that opened in Wheeling in 1925. And Palwaukee's name stood for the airport's location at the intersection of Palatine Road and Milwaukee Avenue. And the Des Plaines connection to Palwaukee comes through Des Plaines couple Sally and Erwin Strempel. who owned and operated Sally's Flying School at Palwaukee Airport from 1950 to 1966. Both Sally and Erwin Strumpel were licensed pilots, and Sally supervised the day-to-day operations of the flying school and was also one of the school's instructors. And Erwin Strumpel's day job was as a lieutenant with the Des Plaines Police Department, but he was also a rated mechanic in addition to being a licensed pilot. So during his time off from the police department, Erwin Strumpel performed all of the maintenance on the training planes for Sally's flying school. And Sally herself, she has quite a story. She was an accomplished pilot who started out flying in a barnstorming act with her sister in the 1930s. And Sally was one of the first female FAA flight examiners in the country and the very first female flight examiner in the state of Illinois. And as a flight instructor, Sally trained over 3,000 pilots. And as a flight examiner, she licensed 1,367 pilots over the course of her career. And Sally also had an admirable safety record of no accidents or scratches ever. So she was a very capable pilot. Now, airfields and airports opened all over the Chicago area in the 20s and 30s, not just here in the northwest suburbs. But the city of Chicago's airports have also played a major role in the story of aviation and Des Plaines as well. And so in the 19th century, Chicago became a transportation crossroads thanks to the railways, waterways, and shipping lines that all crossed through the city. And in the 20th century, as aviation expanded, Chicago sought to maintain this status as a major transportation hub by becoming an air travel crossroads as well. So Chicago built municipal airports in the mid-1920s at Cicero Avenue and 63rd Street. And later on, Chicago Municipal Airport was actually renamed Midway Airport in honor of the World War II naval battle. But by the mid-1930s, less than 10 years after the airport opened, Chicago realized that Municipal Airport's location at 63rd and Cicero had some serious drawbacks. The airport was landlocked at that location. It was surrounded by a residential neighborhood, industrial complexes, and a railway. And all of that made it very difficult for the airport to expand in the future. And in the years leading up to World War II, Illinois and Chicago, aviation officials knew that Chicago would need to build a larger second airport sooner rather than later if the area wanted to remain competitive in the aviation world. So when Douglas Aircraft Company built a C-54 airplane factory at Mannheim and Higgins Roads during World War II, this helped solve the problem for Chicago and provided a viable location for a second commercial airport for the Chicago area after World War II, and that airport would be located just on Des Plaines' doorstep. And so Douglas Aircraft Company, they chose to build a factory in the Chicago area during World War II because their main Santa Monica, California plant was unable to meet the production demands of the military for C-54 transport aircraft during the war. And Douglas, like a lot of other companies with defense contracts during World War II, they built their new wartime plants away from the coastal areas and in the center of the country instead, in order to protect these facilities from the possibility of an enemy air attack. So Douglas turned to the Midwest in 1942 for their new C-54 factory. And Douglas chose this location near Mannheim and Higgins, just southwest of Mannheim and Higgins in Orchard Place. They chose that site due to the strength of the nearby Chicago labor markets, the nearby railways and highways, which provided an easy way to get supplies to the plant and also an easy number of commuting options for their employees. And Chicago's agreement to extend city water lines to the site also helped, as well as the flat farmland in the Orchard Place area surrounding Mannheim and Higgins. That would make construction of the plants and test airfield much easier. And so all of these factors together helped make the site near Mannheim and Higgins very attractive to Douglas. And in 1942, the U.S. Army Air Force bought this land in Orchard Place, southwest of Manheim and Higgins, and they bought it for war production use, but they leased the property to Douglas Aircraft for the duration of the war so that they could use it to build planes for the Army Air Force and the Navy. And so construction began on the Chicago Douglas plants in July of 1942. And their 1,600-acre complex was finished and fully operational only 9 months later in April 1943. And Douglas received permission to work around the clock to construct the plants. And wartime blackout regulations were waived so that construction crews could use lights to work at night, which is how they were able to build such a large facility in only 9 months. And the map of the site that's here on the screen shows just what made up that 1,600-acre site. An assembly building, a freestanding cafeteria, a personnel building, administration building, a hangar. They also had a test airfield with 4 runways and several large parking lots for employees. So the fact that all of this was constructed in just 9 months is pretty impressive, since that is a lot of building that needed to be done. And so the Chicago Douglas plant, they produced C-54 Skymasters, which were called the R-5D by the Navy and the DC-4 by civilian commercial airlines. And the C-54 was really a workhorse for the military, as it evacuated wounded soldiers from active combat areas to hospitals that were further behind the lines, which the 2 photographs on the right-hand side of the screen show the C-54 fulfilling that duty of medical air evacuation. And then the bottom left photo shows the C-54. Another one of the things that it did a lot was deliver supplies and mail as well to troops on the battlefront, which the photo on the bottom left shows a C-54 being loaded with supplies there. But the C-54 also transported troops themselves around the world as well. And in its 2.5 years of operation, the Chicago Douglas plant built 655 of these planes during World War II. And the military used the C-54 beyond World War II. They used these planes into the 1970s. And it was actually just a few years after World War II that the C-54 really had their most famous moment on the world stage, and that was during the Berlin airlift. And during the Berlin airlift in 1948 and 1949, nearly all of the C-54s in the Air Force fleet transported food and coal to the citizens of West Berlin. And C-54s that were built here locally at the Chicago Douglas plant were undoubtedly part of that effort during the Berlin airlift. And as the DC-4, as a civilian plane, the C-54, the DC-4, was commonly found in major commercial airline fleets throughout the post-war era. But in May of 1945, so about 2 years after the plant opened, Douglas reported that at that time they had an employment level of 16,000 people at the Chicago Douglas plants. And 6,200 of those employees were women, which meant that almost 40% of the plant's employees were women. And now the Douglas plants operated on a 24-hour basis, 6 days a week in 3 shifts. And no experience or technical knowledge was required to work at Douglas, since the company provided any training that was needed. And Douglas actually teamed up with the Maine Township High School Industrial Arts Department to operate the plant's training school. And so classes were offered at Douglas to train employees, and they also offered classes at the high school, the Maine East High School today, on nights and weekends to train Douglas employees. And now the photos that I have here on the screen are from the plant's, one of the plant's newsletters. And so each issue of their newsletter featured the work of a different job classification at the plant. And this one here on the screen shows the installers general doing their work inside of the fuselage of the plane. And so they installed absolutely everything inside the plane, from the floor tiles and the ceiling tiles, all the way to the engine controls and the throttles in the cockpits. And Douglas, the company, provided housing assistance for employees who wanted to live near the plant. And many did move to Des Plaines, specifically because of their work at Douglas. And they moved into houses that were also built specifically for Douglas employees. One neighborhood that was built with Douglas employees in mind was the Westfield Homes subdivision, which, as the advertisement that's here on the screen says, it was marketed specifically to Douglas folks, they said. That was printed in the Des Plaines Journal in 1943. So all throughout those 2 years that Douglas was in operation, employees were moving here to the area to work at the plants. But there were a lot of employees who worked at Douglas who chose not to move up here to Des Plaines. So to help those employees out, the company helped to organize carpools so that everybody had an easy way to get to work. But all right, I just mentioned a moment ago that almost 40% of Douglas employees were women, and a fair number of these women were also mothers. So Douglas provided their working mothers with childcare for their children who were too young for school through a partnership with the Children's Welfare Committee of Des Plaines. And together they operated a nursery for Douglas children aged 2 through 6 in a building that stood at 1040 Lee Street in Des Plaines. And the cost of the nursery was 60 cents per day per child. And employees could either drop their children off at the nursery on their way into the plants, or they could drop their children off at the plant's personnel building for busing to the nursery. And so the children in the photograph here are at the plant's personnel building waiting for the bus to take them to the nursery. And there's one child who is receiving their daily health screening with the nursery employee looking into her mouth with the flashlights. And all children did receive a quick health screening when they arrived at the nursery every day. Since sick children, they were still admitted to the nursery, but they spent the day in an isolation room under the care of the nursery's nurse on staff, so that their mothers could continue their war work at the plant and did not need to miss work to care for a sick child. And so what was it like to work at Douglas? What was the company culture like? And the Douglas Aircraft Company, they knew that maintaining high morale among their employees would likely lead to high productivity at the plants, which would in turn benefit the war efforts and help the U.S. and our allies win World War II. So keeping morale high was a priority. And to do that, the company organized social and recreational opportunities for their employees through clubs, dances, sports teams, and even the Queen of Douglas beauty pageants, which was held in the ballroom of the Michigan Avenue Hotel. And Douglas liked to bring in entertainment, musical entertainment for their employees during their lunch breaks in the cafeteria, and they referred to that as Thermos Theater. The company also sponsored a monthly trivia contest with the questions submitted by the employees themselves. And a group of musically talented Douglas employees actually formed their own band called the Douglas Airs, and they can be seen performing in the photo at the top left. And the Douglas Airs, they played at company dances and events, but they also played at events in the wider community as well, including the 1943 Des Plaines Police Benefit Dance. And employees with common hobbies and interests, they formed their own clubs, like the Roller Skating Club, which I have a photograph of that club on the top right of the screen. There was also the Ice Skating Club, the Equestrian Club, the Douglas Flying Club, just to name a few. And the Douglas Flying Club, their logo is at the bottom right of that screen. And the Flying Club actually allowed employees who were interested in flying airplanes after spending their time at the plant building airplanes all day. They could pool their money together to pay for flying lessons in a training airplane as part of the Douglas Flying Club, which helped bring the expense of learning to fly down a little bit by everybody pooling their money together for the lessons. But plants departments also form sports teams like basketball teams and bowling teams that competed in leagues against each other in a company league. So Douglas, building aircraft at Douglas for the war effort was a very serious and important job. But Douglas did encourage their employees to enjoy each other's company and have fun in their time off as well in order to maintain high morale at the plant during war. Now, in 1944, Maine Township High School students also became involved with the Douglas plants when they raised funds in a war bond drive to sponsor the production of a C-54. And in just 2 weeks, in December 1944, the high school students raised over $500,000 in war bonds to fund a plane. And that's $500,000 in 1944 dollars. So quite a large sum of money and really quite an achievement as well. And during the fundraising campaign, homerooms competed against one another to sell the bonds, the war bonds, and students went door to door seeking war bond commitments from their neighbors in Des Plaines and Park Ridge as well. And in recognition of this fundraising achievement, Douglas gave Maine Township High School students the honor of naming the plane that they financed. And you can see the plane on the right-hand side of the screen at its dedication in 1945. And the students, they chose the name Maine Flyer. And the nose arts on the plane featured the slogan, "Faster and Higher, that's Maine Flyer." The U.S. Navy took delivery of the Maine Flyer in March 1945, and soon after, Maine Township High School alumni in the military told the school that they had seen the Maine Flyer at the U.S. Naval Air Station in Alameda, California. And they said that the plane was serving as a medical air evacuation transport for wounded servicemen. And the Maine Flyer was flown by the military until 1971, when it was retired for military service. The plane spent many of its post-military years in the fleets of an aerial firefighting organization in Arizona. And more recently, in the 21st century, Park Ridge resident Len Johnson was inspired by the Maine Flyer's story and spent many years performing extensive research to discover the Maine Flyer's post-military history and also its whereabouts as well. And he tracked the plane down in Arizona. And in 2019, Len Johnson received permission to salvage some pieces from the plane before it was scrapped. And he has generously loaned several pieces of the cockpits to the History Center for our current exhibits. And the photo on the screen shows those pieces, the pilot's seat, the steering yoke, and part of the instrument panel. So thanks to Len Johnson, a little bit of the Maine Flyer has returned to the communities where it was built and financed, Des Plaines and Park Ridge. So when World War II ended in August 1945, the post-war fates of the Chicago Douglas plants was a hot topic here in the Chicago area. Douglas closed the plant shortly after the war ended, and with the end of the war, their lease on the property ended as well. So the land reverted back to the possession of the Army Air Force. And throughout World War II, Chicago and Illinois aviation officials, they kept their eye on the Douglas test airfields at the plants because they thought this was an ideal site for Chicago's second commercial airports. And I mentioned earlier that those aviation officials, they knew that Chicago's existing airports, municipal airport, which is called Midway today, was landlocked at 63rd and Cicero. Which prevented the expansion that was necessary, really, to support the bigger and faster planes that were being flown in the post-war era. And at the municipal airport site also just did not have the space to build enough runways to keep pace with the higher level of air traffic that they hoped for after the war as well. But the Douglas test airfields already had 4 runways built, so they had a good existing base. And the area was also surrounded by the flat farmland of Orchard Place, which made it easy for ideal expansion, unlike at Midway. And the only downside that these officials could see to putting in new airports at the Douglas location in Manheim and Higgins was that it was kind of far away from the loop. But an already planned post-war interstate highway system solved that problem for them very easily. And today it's the Kennedy Expressway. It's a branch of that system that connects the loop with the airports and the Douglas site. So in 1946, the Army Air Force, they turned the Douglas site over to the city of Chicago, and Chicago, they quickly began acquiring additional land surrounding Douglas in Orchard Place so they could build this new airport, which they were referring to already as Chicago Orchard Airport as a nod to the area where it was located, Orchard Place. And the construction process was a very long, extensive project that began in the late 1940s and continued throughout the 1950s. But the Chicago City Council decided early on a new name for Chicago Orchard Airport. And in 1949, they decided to change the name of the airport to OHara. And the name honors Edward Butch O'Hare, who was a Navy pilot and Medal of Honor recipient from World War II. And O'Hare single-handedly shot down 5 Japanese planes and helped save his aircraft carrier, the Lexington, in February 1942. And he was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions. And the following year, in 1943, unfortunately, O'Hare was killed in action. But his connection to Chicago, and the reason why the airport was named for him, that Chicago connection, is kind of an interesting one. O'Hare was born in St. Louis and mostly grew up there as well, but he did spend a lot of time in Chicago growing up since his father moved to Chicago after his parents divorced in 1927. And O'Hare's father was a lawyer, a dog track owner, and also an associate of Al Capone. But O'Hare's father, he worked with federal agents and provided the IRS with the evidence that they needed to arrest and convict Al Capone for tax evasion. And for that, O'Hare's father was killed by the mob in 1939, just before Capone was released from Alcatraz. And so the airport, it was named for Edward O'Hare, Butch O'Hare, but the 3-letter airport designation code did not change. That remained the same as it was prior to 1949, ORD for Orchard Airport. And that is still the 3-letter airport code that O'Hare uses today, and is a way that we still have a bit of the legacy of the airport's beginnings as a little grass airstrip in the middle of the orchards and farm fields that were located in Orchard Place, just south of Des Plaines. So the name of the airport was decided in 1949, but it wasn't until 1955 that commercial air traffic began at O'Hare. And the construction process of converting the Douglas plant's test airfield into a major world airport was a project that lasted for almost a decade. The 4 existing runways at Douglas had to be lengthened and reinforced to support the heavier and faster planes that were flown after World War II. More runways and taxiways needed to be built since they were expecting a much higher level of traffic at the airport than there ever was at the Douglas site. And they also needed to build things like a passenger terminal, cargo facility, parking lots, customs and immigration facilities, and service tunnels as well. So all of those things needed to be taken care of before the airport could open. So it really was quite an extensive project. But by 1955, enough runways and a large enough portion of the passenger terminal were finished so that commercial air traffic could begin, even though construction of the wider airport was still ongoing. And it was only 7 years later, in 1962, that O'Hare was named the world's busiest airport for the first time. And in 1963, the following year, was O'Hare's first full year of taking over from Midway as Chicago's primary airport, with about 1,500 flights traveling through the airport per day in 1963. And O'Hare's location, just south of Des Plaines, attracted a number of businesses to the area and really contributed to the post-World War II economic growth of Des Plaines. And businesses that served the aviation industry and airline passengers, they all quickly moved into the area surrounding the airports, including locations that were in Des Plaines. But O'Hare also attracted a lot of businesses from industries other than aviation, as a lot of companies saw the value in a location near a major world airport, rail lines, and the new interstate highway system. And a lot of these businesses moved into the office parks and industrial complexes in Des Plaines that were close to O'Hare. But O'Hare also created a lot of new business for existing Des Plaines companies. And so there are two examples. United Motor Coach, which is in the photo on the right-hand side of the screen with a few of their buses from the 50s and 60s. And Kinder Hardware, and there's an advertisement from Kinder's from 1990 on the left side of the screen. And United Motor Coach was called Pace Bus today, and they added the airport to their regular route schedules soon after O'Hare opened and gained a new passenger base from travelers and airport employees. But the second example of Kinder Hardware shows how a lot of Des Plaines retailers benefited from the new business created by construction and expansion projects, both at O'Hare and in building all of the office parks and industrial sites that surrounded the airport as well. Retailers in Des Plaines, like Kinder Hardware, they supplied these industrial contractors. And Kinder's actually decided to change their name to Kinder Industrial Supply in 1971 to really underscore and market their business to this new customer pool of contractors. And in 1979, tragedy occurred at O'Hare on the Friday of Memorial Day weekend, when American Airlines Flight 191 crashed shortly after takeoff. And the plane crashed at the old Ravenswood Airport in Des Plaines, just north of Touhy Avenue from O'Hare. And all on board the plane died, as well as two men who'd been working in the building on the ground. And an investigation into the crash discovered that one of the plane's engines fell from the wing during takeoff. And improper maintenance procedures had led to the weakening of bolts in the engine pylon, which caused that engine to fall. And those procedures were swiftly banned after the crash to prevent another tragedy like this from happening. And Flight 191 today remains the deadliest non-terrorist commercial aviation disaster in American history. And a memorial to the crash is located at Lake Park in Des Plaines, and that was dedicated 10 years ago in 2011. And the memorial for Flight 191, it was created by students from the Decatur Classical School in Chicago as part of the Project Citizen program, which is a program that fosters civic engagement in students ages 5th through 8th grades. And the students were inspired to create the memorial by the story of their assistant principal who lost both of her parents on Flight 191. And Decatur Classical School students, they worked with local elected officials and the Des Plaines Park District to design and plan the memorial, which includes bricks with the names of each individual lost in the crash, and was designed with the themes of nature and healing in mind. And the memorial wall, which includes the bricks with the names of everyone who was lost in the crash. That is located on the screen here. And the Flight 191 Memorial was dedicated at Lake Park, Lake Opeka, in Des Plaines 10 years ago in 2011. And now in the 2000s, OHara announced plans for the OHara Modernization Program to reconfigure their existing runways and build additional runways to decrease delays and also increase flight capacity at the airport. And the construction of two runways at the far north and far south ends of OHara impacted Des Plaines the most. And the new northern runway, which I have marked in orange, its rough location near Toohey Avenue at the north side of the airport. That runway was planned on land that did stand within the city of Des Plaines and forced the relocation of 55 businesses and the loss of 9 homes as well. But about half of those businesses were able to stay in Des Plaines and move to new locations in Des Plaines. And that runway opened in 2008. And the southern runway, which is also marked in orange on my map here, its rough location north of Irving Park Road. That runway was planned on the site of St. John's Cemetery. And St. John's Cemetery belonged to St. John's United Church of Christ, which was founded in the late 1840s as St. Johannes Evangelical and Reformed Church by the German farm families that lived in Orchard Place, which was the unincorporated community that was just south of Des Plaines. And St. John's, they moved both their congregation and the church building to Bensonville in 1951 during OHara's initial phases of construction, but they left the cemetery behind due to the expense and long legal process that was typically involved in moving cemeteries. So the photographs here show some of the gravestones at St. John's Cemetery in the 1970s. But St. John's did remain an active cemetery into the 21st century, but burials occurred infrequently due to the difficulties in accessing the site and also the disruption that the jet noise from OHara would cause to burial services. And St. John's Church, they fought against the southern runway's construction and the displacement of their cemetery, but they lost their legal challenge in 2012. And so when they lost that legal challenge, the city of Chicago and St. John's, they worked to complete extensive genealogical research to identify the next of kin for the individuals buried in this cemetery, so that the next of kin could choose where to rebury, what cemeteries to rebury their ancestors in. And the southern runway that was on the St. John's Cemetery site, that opened in 2013. So as we've seen today, there is a long history of aviation in Des Plaines over the course of the last century. And aviation did play a role in the growth of Des Plaines from a small town in the 1920s when the first airports were forming in the area to the modern suburb that we have here today in the 21st century. So if you're interested in learning more about aviation in Des Plaines and hearing more stories about aviators, airports, and businesses than I was able to get into in the talk today, then please stop by and check out our exhibit, Des Plaines Takes Flights, when we are able to reopen. And that exhibit will be displayed throughout 2021. It'll be there through the end of the year, so still plenty of time to stop by and see it. But that is all I have for you today on aviation in the Des Plaines area. So thank you for joining us. And I can take a few questions if there are any questions at all.
It looks like there's one in the chat box. I also unlocked people's ability to unmute themselves. So if you have a question or would like to chime in, go ahead and get our attention by chat or by unmuting yourself. So the question in the chat box from Steve is, do we know what kind of orchards were at Orchard Field or Orchard Place?
I They were. I do know that some of the orchards were apple orchards. I believe there were a few other kinds of fruit trees that were planted there as well. But I do know that the Scott family, who is one of the founding families of Orchard Place, the town of Orchard Place was on land that the Scotts subdivided and sold from their orchards. And they did have a lot of apples because they also operated an apple press. They sold apple vinegar, apple cider, and that press that they had was actually located in town in Des Plaines. So some of the orchards were apple orchards, but I believe there were other kinds of fruit as well, but I'm not sure what those other kinds of fruit were.
Yeah, I think I've only heard of apples there.
Yeah.
For anyone who joined us late, I do want to draw your attention to the chat. There is, once again, the link to the Joy of History 2021 campaign. So again, we never require donations, but we always appreciate it. It helps us do such wonderful research like Siobhan has presented for us.
Okay, Stephen, you're unmuted.
Yes, thank you. Very informative presentation. I really enjoyed it. In your research on aviation in that area, did you come across anything involving blimps, dirigibles, and airships during the early 20th century?
Yes, actually. We came across some connections with Des Plaines and the Goodyear blimps. Actually, there were several Des Plaines residents who worked with the Goodyear blimp during the World's Fair in 1934 that was held in Chicago. And one of the Goodyear blimps that was flown over the fair was actually housed at Palwaukee Airport in a hangar there when it wasn't in use. And there were 3 or 4 guys who were from Des Plaines who did work with the Goodyear blimp during the fair. But there was another connection to Goodyear during World War II. One of the Radline brothers, I believe it was Lawrence Radline. That might not be right. It may not have been Lawrence. It was one of the Radline brothers. I can't remember his first name, which specific one it was, but he worked for the Goodyear Company in Ohio for many years, and during World War II was involved with a big project that Goodyear had building blimps for the Navy during the war. So there was a connection to blimps and Des Plaines for certain, yes.
You pointed out the Westfield advertisement for houses during the war. I just want to also point out that the brick half Georgians, the small but 2-story brick houses that are on the Mannheim S curve and along Dempster and Wolf and Rose. Those were wartime projects to house families of people who were working at Douglas, as well as the duplexes south of Oakton on White and the surrounding streets just south of Oakton there, as well as similar structures in Park Ridge. So there was a lot of suburban development that occurred as a result of the wartime projects in our landscape.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely.
Looks like Steve dropped in the chat. There's a photo of the World's Fair blimp at the Wheeling History Museum. So our friends over at Wheeling have some images if you're interested in that.
All right, yeah, that is good to know. I did not know of those, so that is good to know.
Well, I think we could wrap it up there. Thank you very much, Siobhan.
All right.